The annual harvest celebration at Moore Vineyards had always been a grand affair, but this year was different. The vineyard had narrowly escaped bankruptcy just 6 months ago, and if it weren't for my investment, none of this would be happening. I stood near the long wooden table, filled with bottles of our finest wines, the flickering candlelight casting a warm glow over the guests. My parents, Thomas and Margaret, were at the head of the crowd, smiling as if they had built this business alone. My younger sister, Andrea, stood beside them in a sleek designer dress, her expression radiant. She had never worked the fields, never dealt with suppliers, never sat through grueling meetings with banks. And yet, when my father tapped his glass for attention, I felt a strange sense of unease crawl up my spine. "Tonight is not just a celebration of another successful harvest," my father began, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "It's the beginning of a new chapter for Moore Vineyards." I took a sip of my wine, expecting him to thank me, to acknowledge that without my $850,000 investment, none of this would be possible. But instead, he turned to Andrea with a proud smile. "We are thrilled to announce that Andrea will be taking over as CEO, leading our family business into the future." Applause erupted. I felt my wine glass freeze halfway to my lips. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. "Andrea? CEO?" My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I forced myself to stay still, to keep my face neutral. Around me, guests smiled and clapped as Andrea stepped forward, basking in the attention. My mother beamed with pride. My father gave Andrea a supportive pat on the back. And I stood there, invisible, as if I had played no role in saving this vineyard from collapse. Andrea cleared her throat, her voice dripping with excitement. "Thank you, everyone. This business is our family's legacy, and I promise to honor it with everything I have." She glanced in my direction with the faintest smirk. "With my education and fresh perspective, I know we can take Moore Vineyards to new heights." I tightened my grip on my glass. Fresh perspective, that was their excuse. I had built a successful investment consulting firm from the ground up. I knew how to manage money, negotiate deals, and analyze markets. Andrea, on the other hand, had spent the past few years posting curated photos of wine glasses on social media and talking about brand elevation. And now she was being handed the reins to a business I had financially saved. I felt my mother's hand on my arm. "Jessica, honey," she said softly, "I hope you understand. Andrea's MBA makes her the natural choice for this role." I turned to look at her, searching for any sign of guilt or hesitation in her face, but there was none. They had already convinced themselves that this was the right decision, that I, the daughter who had pulled them out of financial ruin, was somehow not fit to lead. I smiled, though my fingers dug into the stem of my glass. "Of course, Mom, Andrea will do great." I clinked my glass against hers, watching as she sighed in relief, oblivious to the storm rising inside me. The betrayal burned, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not here, not tonight. Instead, I stepped back, excusing myself from the crowd and walking toward the vineyard, away from the laughter, the celebration, and the false gratitude. The crisp night air filled my lungs as I reached the edge of the fields. I stared at the neatly aligned rows of vines, thinking about all the late nights I had spent reviewing financial statements, negotiating with creditors, convincing the bank to extend their loan instead of seizing the property. I had done it because this was my family's business, because I believed in preserving what generations before us had built, but my investment had not been seen as a lifeline. It had been seen as a donation, a favor from the responsible daughter, the one who could always land on her feet. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my fingers hovering over my contacts. My attorney, Rachel Thompson, was one call away. I could already hear her voice in my head. "Did they put anything in writing? Any agreement that your investment secured your stake?" No, they hadn't, because I had trusted them. My grip tightened on the phone. The rational part of me said to let it go. This was family. But another part, the part that had fought tooth and nail to build my own success, whispered that this was not just a personal betrayal. This was business. And if they wanted to treat me like an outsider, then I would show them exactly what I had learned from playing by the rules of high-stakes finance. I took a slow breath, feeling a strange calm settle over me. If Andrea wanted to play CEO, if my parents thought they could erase my contribution, then it was time for them to learn a lesson. They had underestimated me. And that was their first mistake. The morning after the harvest celebration, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee. The bitterness of last night still lingered, heavier than the drink in front of me. My father's voice played over and over in my head, each word another cut. Andrea will be taking over as CEO. It wasn't just that they had given her the position, it was the ease with which they had dismissed me, as if my contribution had never mattered. As if the $850,000 I had transferred to save the vineyard was a minor footnote in the story of their success. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my messages. Nothing from my parents, nothing from Andrea, not even a token attempt at justifying their decision. They had made their choice, and in their minds I was supposed to accept it. I took a slow breath and tapped on Rachel Thompson's contact. She picked up on the second ring. "Jessica, I was wondering when I'd hear from you," she said, her tone a mixture of amusement and expectation. I exhaled sharply. "I need your help with a family business matter. Are you free today?" "Of course," she said without hesitation. "Come by my office at noon. Bring any documentation you have." 3 hours later, I sat across from her in a sleek downtown law office, the floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view of the city skyline. Rachel leaned back in her chair, flipping through the bank statements I had printed that morning. The crisp pages rustled as she turned them, her sharp eyes scanning every number. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "Let me get this straight," she said, setting the papers down. "You transferred your entire savings, $850,000, directly into Moore Vineyard's account. No contract, no official agreement, just a verbal promise from your parents that you'd have a secured place in the business?" I clenched my jaw. It wasn't just a promise, it was understood. They told me they'd take care of me, that this was my investment in our family's future. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temple. "Jessica, verbal agreements in family businesses are a nightmare to enforce, but let's focus on what we can prove. What exactly did they promise you in return?" I thought back to that desperate phone call from my father, the panic in his voice when he told me the vineyard was on the verge of foreclosure. They said that my investment would secure my position in the company, that I'd be involved in major decisions. Rachel picked up her pen and jotted down a few notes. "And yet they just handed the CEO position to your sister without so much as a conversation." "Exactly." I folded my arms, my nails pressing into my sleeves. "And that's not even the worst part. Something feels off about this. My father acted like Andrea was the obvious choice, like she had always been the plan. But 6 months ago, they were begging me for money. If she was such a brilliant business mind, why didn't they put her in charge back then?" Rachel tilted her head, considering. That's a good question. Have you looked at their financials since you transferred the money?" I hesitated. "I don't have access. My father has always controlled the book." Rachel's eyes gleamed. "Then that's where we start. If they misused your investment, spent it on personal expenses, moved it around without your knowledge, then we have leverage." A spark of determination flared in my chest. "How do we get access?" "2 options," Rachel said. 1, you ask nicely, which I assume won't get you very far. 2, we send a formal legal request for transparency, which will put them on edge. I knew my parents well enough to know that they would stonewall me. If they had nothing to hide, they would have at least acknowledged my role in saving the vineyard, but they hadn't. Which meant Rachel was right. There was something else going on. "Send the request," I said. Rachel smiled. "Now we're talking." By the time I left her office, my mind was already racing through the possibilities. If my parents had kept my money separate, if they had truly used it to save the business, they wouldn't have a problem handing over the records. But if they stalled, if they made excuses, then I'd have my answer. That evening, I drove out to the vineyard, determined to get ahead of whatever storm was coming. The estate looked as picturesque as ever, the rolling hills of grapevines stretching into the horizon, but tonight it felt different, colder, less like home. I parked near the main building and stepped inside, the familiar scent of oak barrels and fermenting grapes filling the air. Andrea was in the office, lounging in my father's old chair, scrolling through her phone. When she looked up and saw me, she smirked. "Jessica, to what do I owe the pleasure?" I shut the door behind me. "You tell me. Since when were you the future of this company?" Andrea leaned back, crossing her arms. "Dad and Mom made the decision. They wanted someone with real business knowledge." I clenched my fists. "I run an investment consulting firm, Andrea. I manage portfolios worth more than this vineyard." She rolled her eyes. Yeah, but that's different. You deal with numbers. This is about branding, vision. You mean PR? I cut in. Posting pictures of wine glasses on Instagram and calling it leadership? Andrea's smirk faltered, but only for a second. Look, Jess, I get that you're upset, but this isn't personal. It's business. And frankly, you've been too focused on your real career to be here full time. Mom and Dad needed stability. Stability? I let out a humorless laugh. I gave them stability. Without my money, you'd be managing a foreclosure, not a vineyard. Andrea waved a dismissive hand. And we're grateful, but that doesn't mean you get to run the place. You should be happy, Jess. You're successful. Why do you even care? I stared at her, the words hitting me like a slap. That was it. That was why they had done this. They thought I didn't need it. That because I had built something on my own, I wouldn't fight for what was mine. I took a step closer, my voice calm but firm. I care because this isn't just about money. It's about respect. And if you think I'm just going to walk away, you don't know me at all. Andrea's expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe a hint of unease. But she recovered quickly. Well, whatever you're planning, good luck with that. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, she added, Oh, and Jess, just let it go. It's done. I didn't look back as I walked out of the office, but inside something hardened. Andrea thought this was over. My parents assumed I'd accept my place as the dutiful daughter who always helped but never took. They were wrong. It wasn't over, it was just beginning. I didn't hear from my parents for 2 days after Rachel sent the request for financial transparency. No calls, no messages. It was unusual. My mother, at the very least, had a habit of checking in on me after any big family discussion, usually to smooth things over and convince me that whatever injustice had been dealt was just how things had to be. But this time, silence. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't ignoring me because they thought I would get over it. They were scrambling. On the 3rd day, my father finally called. I let the phone ring twice before answering, making him wait just long enough to know I wasn't eager. Jessica, he said, his voice calm, measured. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights outside my window. About? A pause. This request. The lawyer, the financial review. It's unnecessary. If you had concerns, you could have come to me directly. I smiled to myself. There it was. The subtle shift, the attempt to reframe me as unreasonable. I did come to you directly, I said. And you made it clear that my involvement in this company wasn't needed. He exhaled sharply. That's not what I meant. Look, Jess, this is a family business. You know that. Bringing in lawyers makes things complicated. That depends, I said. Are there things that should be complicated? Of course not, he snapped, but then softened his tone. We just don't want unnecessary tension. Your investment saved the vineyard and we're grateful. But, Andrea was handed something she didn't earn. She's family, he said, as if that explained everything. And she has a vision for the vineyard, a future. And what about my future, I asked, my voice steady. I invested more money than she's ever touched. That wasn't charity, Dad. That was my stake in this business. There was a long pause, and for the first time, I heard something different in his silence. Not just frustration, but hesitation. Jessica, he said slowly, I need you to trust me. A chill ran through me. Why? Because if you keep pushing this, you're going to regret it. I sat up straighter, the shift in his tone setting every nerve in my body on edge. Is that a threat? Of course not, he said too quickly. But you're stirring up trouble where there isn't any. Let this go before it becomes something you can't take back. I gripped the edge of my desk, my nails pressing into the wood. Before I can't take it back? You're making this a fight, he said, his voice carrying the same dismissive authority I had grown up with. And there doesn't need to be one. I inhaled deeply, forcing my pulse to slow. Then send the documents. If there's nothing wrong, there's nothing to fight about. Another pause, then a clipped, I'll see what I can do. I hung up, my heart pounding. The next day I received an email from Rachel. Attached were a set of financial documents hastily scanned into a PDF. There were gaps, entire months missing from the records, but what was there was enough to confirm what I had suspected. They had spent my money on more than just the vineyard. Rachel and I sat in her office, papers spread across the desk, red marks circling numbers that didn't add up. "Look at this," she said, tapping a transaction. "The week after your transfer, your father paid off a personal loan, one that had nothing to do with the vineyard." I stared at the line item. A six-figure payment wiped out in one move. They were in deeper trouble than they let on, I muttered. "And this," Rachel continued, flipping to another page, "a month later, a transfer from the Vineyard's account to Moore Holdings LLC, $250,000. I stiffened. "That's Andrea's company." Rachel nodded. "And here's where it gets interesting. Moore Holdings wasn't even active until after you invested. It was registered 2 weeks after your transfer." A slow, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. So they used my money to funnel into a separate business, one Andrea controls? "Which means if the vineyard collapses, Andrea still has assets under her name," Rachel said. "And you? You have nothing." I let out a shaky breath. "They planned this." Rachel leaned back in her chair. "I'd say so. Your father kept the vineyard afloat with your money just long enough to shift things into Andrea's name. And now, he probably thinks he can convince you to back down before you dig too deep." I clenched my fists, rage curling through me. They hadn't just dismissed me. They had used me. Rachel watched me carefully. "What do you want to do?" I met her gaze, my voice steady. "We hit them where it hurts." That evening, I drove back to the vineyard. My parents weren't expecting me, and I didn't call ahead. I walked straight into the office where my father was reviewing invoices at his desk. He looked up, startled. "Jessica," he said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" I placed a folder in front of him. "Thought I'd save you the trouble of finding those missing documents." His face darkened as he flipped it open. "Where did you get these?" "Does it matter?" I crossed my arms. "I know everything, Dad. The loan, the transfers, Moore Holdings. You and Andrea siphoned money out of this company before she was even CEO. You never intended to keep me in this business. You just needed me to pay for it." His jaw tightened. "That's not what happened." "Then explain it to me." He pushed the folder aside. "You're overreacting. The vineyard is thriving. We made the best decisions for the future of this family." "No," I said coldly. "You made the best decisions for Andrea. And you stole from me to do it." His eyes flashed. "Be careful, Jessica." I leaned forward, resting my hands on his desk. "No, you be careful, because I'm done playing nice. You have 2 choices. 1, you return every cent that was funneled into Andrea's company, or 2, I take this to court, and you lose more than just my investment. You lose this vineyard. You lose your name." For the first time, I saw something crack in his expression, not just anger, fear. "You wouldn't," he said. "Try me," I said, my voice unwavering. I turned and walked out, not waiting for his response. This wasn't just about getting my money back anymore. This was about taking back what was mine. And if they thought I would stop now, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I woke up the next morning with a clear plan in my mind. My father had underestimated me for years, assuming I would always be the dutiful daughter, the one who put family first, the one who wouldn't fight back no matter how many times they pushed me aside. That version of me was gone. They had crossed a line, and now they were going to feel the consequences. Rachel called early, her voice sharp and focused. "I've started drafting the legal notice. If they don't return the funds, we'll file a formal lawsuit. But there's something else we need to discuss." I rubbed my temple, already bracing myself. "What now?" "The vineyard's financials," she said. "After reviewing the records they sent over, I requested additional documents from the state. Your father refinanced the vineyard 3 months ago." I straightened. "Refinanced? Why?" "To pull cash out," Rachel said. "The bank gave them a loan based on the vineyard's projected revenue, but here's where it gets interesting. Most of that money didn't go back into the business. It went into Moore Holdings, meaning not only did they steal from you, but they leveraged the vineyard itself to fund Andrea's new venture." I gripped my phone tighter, my pulse pounding in my ears. "How much?" "About $600,000. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply. So they put the vineyard in even more debt just to funnel money into Andrea's business. Exactly, Rachel said, which means the vineyard isn't as stable as they're pretending it is. If something were to happen, let's say a loss of key clients, a sudden disruption in revenue, your father wouldn't be able to cover the payments. And that, Jessica, gives us leverage. I opened my laptop and pulled up my contacts, scrolling through names of the vineyard's biggest clients, restaurants, distributors, high-end retailers. These were people I had personally introduced to the business, people who had only signed contracts because they trusted me. My father and Andrea might be running the vineyard now, but they were relying on relationships I had built. I clicked on the first name on the list and dialed. By noon, I had spoken to 5 major clients. By the end of the day, 3 of them had agreed to reconsider their contracts. Not outright cancellations, not yet, but they were willing to delay orders, renegotiate terms, quietly pull back commitments. The moment my father started feeling the financial squeeze, I wanted him to know exactly why it was happening. That evening, I drove to the vineyard again. This time, I wasn't sneaking around for answers. I was here to deliver them. My father was in his office, his sleeves rolled up, glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he scanned through spreadsheets. Andrea was beside him, scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention. They both looked up when I stepped inside. "You shouldn't be here," Andrea said immediately, her tone clipped. I ignored her and set a thick envelope down on the desk in front of my father. "Read it." He hesitated, but the tension in my face must have told him I wasn't leaving without a fight. He opened the envelope and scanned the first page. His jaw clenched. "What the hell is this?" "A formal legal demand," I said. "Return the funds that were taken from me, or we go to court." Andrea scoffed, crossing her arms. "You're suing your own family? That's pathetic, Jessica." "What's pathetic," I said coldly, "is stealing from someone who trusted you." My father exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. "Jessica, you need to calm down. We can work this out." "Oh, I am calm," I said, "and I already tried to work this out. You made it clear that you didn't care, so now I don't either." Andrea leaned forward. "What do you even want? Money? Fine, we'll pay you back in installments." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Not good enough. I want every cent, now. And I also want more holdings dissolved." Andrea's face twisted. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious," I said, "because I know about the refinance. I know you pulled $600,000 out of this vineyard just to fund your side project, and I know the vineyard is leveraged to the point where it can't take another financial hit. So here's what's going to happen. Either you return my money and shut down more holdings, or I make sure every investor, every partner, and every client knows exactly how unstable this business really is." My father's face darkened. "You wouldn't." I met his stare, unwavering. "Try me." Andrea stood abruptly, knocking over a stack of papers. "You selfish, ungrateful." "Ungrateful?" I laughed, shaking my head. "I saved this vineyard. You wouldn't even have a business to run if it weren't for me. And this is how you repay me? By stealing from me? By pushing me out?" I stepped closer. "I owe you nothing." Silence filled the room. My father's gaze dropped back to the papers in front of him, his mind already calculating, already searching for a way out of this. But he knew I wasn't bluffing. Finally, he exhaled. "Give me a week." I raised an eyebrow. "You have 3 days?" Andrea let out a sharp breath. "Jessica, you're being unreasonable." I turned to her and "You're a fraud." I walked out before either of them could say another word. By the time I got back home, my phone was already buzzing with messages from my mother, calls, voicemails. I didn't answer. She would only try to convince me to back down, to make peace, to let them get away with it. I wasn't interested in peace. I was interested in justice. Rachel called an hour later. "Well?" "They have 3 days," I said. She chuckled. "You're ruthless." "No," I corrected. "I'm just done being used." 3 days. Either they paid me back or I burned their business to the ground. And for the first time, I was hoping they would choose wrong. The first day passed with silence. No calls, no messages, no attempts at negotiation. That told me one thing. They were scrambling. My father wasn't the type to react impulsively. He was calculating, always looking for an angle, a way to manipulate a situation in his favor. If he hadn't called immediately to push back against my demands, it meant he was trying to figure out if there was a way to outmaneuver me. He was likely speaking with his own lawyer, maybe even talking to Andrea about moving assets around, hoping to stall or make me second-guess my position. But I wasn't bluffing, and I wasn't backing down. On the second day, Rachel called with an update. I heard from their attorney. He was fishing. Wanted to know if you were open to a family discussion before anything escalated. I smirked. A family discussion? That's rich. What did you say? I told him we're happy to have a discussion, as long as it involves them wiring the full amount into your account before the end of the third day. I could hear the satisfaction in Rachel's voice, and it made something inside me settle. For so long, I had played the role they assigned me, the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who never caused trouble. But now, I was the one calling the shots, and they didn't know how to handle it. By the third day, my patience was wearing thin. I had given them time, more than they deserved, and now I wanted results. I checked my bank account, refreshing the page over and over, but there was no deposit, no indication that they were taking my demand seriously. My phone remained silent until noon. Then finally, my mother called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Jessica, please," she started, her voice already heavy with manufactured concern. "Do we really need to do this?" I leaned against my desk, gripping the edge. "You had 3 days. Where's my money?" "We're working on it," she said quickly. "Your father, he just needs more time." I exhaled slowly. "I don't believe that." There was a pause, and then she lowered her voice. "Jess, you're gonna destroy this family. Do you really want that?" A bitter laugh escaped me. "You mean the way you and Dad destroyed my trust? The way you used me and then threw me aside?" "It's not like that," she said. "We never meant to hurt you." "Then fix it," I snapped. "Send me what you owe, or I go public. I'll expose every financial move, every misstep, every deception, and when the banks and investors see how unstable the Vineyard really is, you won't just owe me, you'll owe them." She sucked in a sharp breath. "Jessica." "You have until midnight," I said, then hung up. By nightfall, I knew they weren't going to pay. They had made their decision. They thought they could stall, make me feel guilty, wear me down with their emotional pleas. They still believed I would let it go in the end. But they had made a fatal mistake. They assumed I was still playing by their rules. At exactly 12:01 a.m., I forwarded everything to Rachel. The financial records, the bank statements, the proof of the money transfers, the documentation of their fraudulent refinancing. She called me 10 minutes later. "So, we're doing this?" she asked. I stared out the window, the lights of the city glowing beneath me. "We're doing this." The lawsuit was filed the next morning. The reaction was immediate. By noon, my father had called 3 times. My mother left voicemails that started calm and pleading, but quickly escalated into accusations. Andrea sent a single text. "Are you serious?" Yes, I was. The Vineyard was small compared to corporate businesses, but it had enough investors and stakeholders that a lawsuit like this couldn't be ignored. It would raise questions, cause discomfort, force people to start digging, and that was exactly what I wanted. By the end of the day, I had another message. From one of the Vineyard's biggest clients, a high-end restaurant chain that had carried More Vineyard's wines for years. The owner, Daniel Carter, had always trusted my judgment. "Jessica, just saw the news. What's going on over there? Should we be concerned?" I didn't hesitate before replying, "Yes." By the next morning, the cracks in their foundations started to show. A quiet withdrawal of orders, a temporary hold on a major distribution deal, whispers in the local wine community. My father had spent decades building relationships, securing his reputation, ensuring that More Vineyards was seen as a legacy worth preserving, and now it was unraveling. The final blow came in the form of an emergency board meeting. The Vineyard was still technically a family-owned business, but after the refinancing, outside investors had a say, and now that financial irregularities were surfacing, they wanted answers. I got a text from Rachel late that night. "Your father just called their lawyer. He's panicking. They're trying to find a way out." I leaned back, exhaling. Good. 2 days later, my father requested a meeting. This time, not a fake family discussion, a real one, at the vineyard, in front of the board. I arrived 10 minutes early. The room was tense, the air thick with unspoken tension. My father was already seated at the long table, Andrea beside him. My mother wasn't there. Maybe she couldn't bear to face me. Or maybe they thought it was better if she stayed out of it. The investors sat along the other side of the table looking at me with curiosity. They had heard rumors, seen the reports, and now they wanted to know the truth. My father cleared his throat. "Jessica," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to find a solution." I tilted my head. "You had 3 days. You wasted them." Andrea shifted in her seat, clearly barely holding in her frustration. "You're ruining everything," she hissed. "No, Andrea," I said calmly. "I'm fixing it." I turned to the investors. "You want the truth? Here it is. My father and sister funneled money out of this company into a separate business. They leveraged the vineyard to its breaking point, taking out loans they couldn't afford, and then, when they were supposed to pay me back, they thought they could ignore me." The room was silent. My father's jaw was tight, his hands clenched together. "Jessica." "No," I interrupted. "I'm done listening. Either you return my money now, or I take this further. And if I do, I promise you, this vineyard won't survive the fallout." One of the investors, an older man with silver hair, looked at my father. "Thomas, is this true?" My father hesitated, and that was enough. The board didn't waste time. A decision was made. Andrea was removed from her position. My father was forced to step down, and I was given what I was owed, every cent. But that wasn't all. When the dust settled, I had a choice: walk away or take control. I chose the latter. By the end of the week, More Vineyards wasn't just mine financially, it was mine completely. And as I stood overlooking the fields, the sun setting over the vines, I finally let myself feel it. Victory. The transition wasn't smooth. It never is when you dismantle something that's been built on deception and entitlement. My father and Andrea didn't just walk away quietly, and I hadn't expected them to. Even after the board forced them out, even after the investors had made it clear that they were done supporting reckless financial decisions, they still acted as if they were the victims. The day after the decision was finalized, I walked into the Vineyard's main office, now mine, and found Andrea standing behind the desk, arms crossed as if she belonged there. "This isn't over," she said, her voice steady but edged with barely contained fury. "You think you won, but you don't understand how this business works. You can't run this place. You don't have the experience." I set my bag down, completely unbothered, and yet here I am. She scoffed. "You wouldn't even have a vineyard if it weren't for me and Dad." I leaned against the desk, leveling her with a look. "If it weren't for me, this vineyard would have been sold to the bank 6 months ago. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have had a company to steal from. And if it weren't for you being so damn greedy, you might have actually stayed in power." Andrea's nostrils flared. "You think you can just walk in here and take over? You don't know these people. You don't know the staff, the suppliers, the process." "I know numbers," I cut in, "and numbers don't lie. That's why you and Dad are out and I'm in, because the only thing either of you know how to do is spend money, not make it." Her jaw tightened. "You don't get it, do you? These people, the winemakers, the workers, the distributors, they hate you. You're not part of this world. You're just a cold-hearted businesswoman who thinks she can run a vineyard like a spreadsheet. They'll never follow you." I pushed off the desk and walked to the door, opening it. "Then I guess we'll see, won't we?" She didn't move at first. She was waiting for me to give her an inch, to leave her some power, some control. But I wasn't making the same mistake my father had. I wasn't going to let Andrea linger like a snake in the grass, waiting for an opportunity to strike. "Get out," I said simply. She grabbed her bag, storming past me, but not before throwing over her shoulder, "You're going to regret this." I watched her go, waiting until the sound of her heels faded before stepping fully into my office. My office. The walls were the same, the desk was the same, but everything about it felt different now. By midday, the shift in leadership had made its way through the staff. I could feel the tension when I walked through the main floor, a quiet unease in the way employees glanced at me, their conversations stopping when I passed. Andrea hadn't been wrong about that. They didn't trust me. Not yet. I called for an all-hands meeting in the tasting room. The employees gathered, winemakers, field workers, marketing staff, distributors, all standing in uneasy silence as I stepped to the front. "I know some of you think I don't belong here," I said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I know you've heard stories that Andrea and my father have told you that I don't understand this business, that I don't care about the vineyard, that I only see numbers." A few people shifted uncomfortably. I let the silence stretch just long enough before continuing. "Let me be clear. I saved this business. I put everything I had into keeping this vineyard from collapsing when my father and sister ran it into the ground, and I know that some of you were part of that. I know who approved the unnecessary spending, who overlooked the financial inconsistencies, who turned a blind eye while they funneled money into a separate business while this one was left to rot." The tension in the room sharpened. People exchanged wary glances. "But I also know that some of you had no choice," I said, "that you were stuck just like I was, that you had families to feed, jobs to keep. So here's where we stand. I don't expect blind loyalty. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I do expect one thing: results. If you're here to work, if you're here to actually build something instead of leech off what someone else created, then we're going to be just fine. But if you're not, leave now, because the way this business was run before, that's over." No one moved. I let the silence settle, then nodded. "Good. Get back to work." The first week was rough. Some of the employees quit, loyal to my father and Andrea, unwilling to accept the change. That was fine. I let them go without a fight. The rest, they stayed, and slowly things started shifting. I spent hours with the Vineyard's winemakers, learning every part of the process, proving that I wasn't just some outsider in a suit. I met with suppliers, restructured contracts, cut wasteful spending. I worked late into the night reviewing financial reports, finding ways to repair the damage my father had done. And as the weeks passed, something happened. The employees who had once looked at me with suspicion started nodding when they passed me in the hall. The winemakers started asking for my opinion. The marketing team stopped hesitating before bringing me ideas. I wasn't just running the vineyard, I was earning it. But Andrea wasn't done. One evening, I received a call from a reporter. "Jessica, I wanted to get a comment from you before we run our piece." I frowned. "What piece?" "The one about the leadership change at More Vineyards." Andrea came forward with some concerning accusations. I closed my eyes briefly, inhaling. "Let me guess. She's claiming I stole the company, that I forced my father out, that I used legal loopholes to take something that wasn't mine." The journalist hesitated, more or less. I let out a slow, steady breath. "You can print this. The financial records speak for themselves. The bank loans, the fraudulent transfers, the embezzlement. The reason my father and Andrea aren't here anymore is because they lost their right to be. I didn't steal this company, I saved it." The article ran the next day. It was ruthless. Andrea painted herself as the wronged daughter, claiming that I had always been jealous, that I had manipulated the board, that I had taken the vineyard out of spite. But what she hadn't counted on was the truth. I released the financial documents, the proof of the stolen funds, the contracts, the investor statements, the legal filings. And suddenly, Andrea wasn't a victim, she was a fraud. The backlash was immediate. Her reputation was destroyed. The whispers in the wine industry turned into open discussions. She tried to pivot, to start another business, but no one trusted her. And my father? He stayed quiet. He knew better than to try and defend himself. A month later, I stood at the edge of the vineyard, the fields stretching before me, the sunset casting everything in gold. The staff was still working late, preparing for the next big harvest, the energy in the air different now, stronger, more stable. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy, you ruined everything. Andrea?" I stared at the message for a long moment before typing my response. "No, Andrea, I fixed it." And then finally I blocked her number. The vineyard was finally mine, but the weight of it didn't fully hit me until the last of the legal paperwork was finalized. There was no more waiting for my father to make his next move, no more bracing for Andrea's desperate attempts to regain control. It was over. And yet, even with my victory secured, there was something unsettling about the silence that followed. After months of battles, the absence of conflict felt almost unnatural. I sat in my office, looking over the latest reports. Profits were steady, expenses were finally under control, and the contracts I had renegotiated were already improving cash flow. The vineyard was stable for the first time in years. And yet, my mind kept circling back to something Rachel had said after we won. Now that you have it, what are you going to do with it? I had spent so much time fighting to reclaim what was mine that I hadn't thought about what came next. The answer came that evening. I walked through the vineyard, the air crisp with the scent of fermenting grapes, the harvest in full swing. Workers moved through the rows, their voices carrying in the cool night. I passed the production facility, where barrels lined the walls, each holding the potential for something incredible. And that's when it hit me. I had been so focused on proving that I could run this vineyard that I hadn't stopped to think about how I could make it better. The next morning, I called a meeting with the senior staff, the winemakers, the marketing team, the operations managers. They all gathered in the tasting room, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. I know this transition hasn't been easy, I started. And I know some of you were loyal to my father. Some of you may even still believe Andrea should be the one running things. But I'm not here to erase the past. I'm here to build a future. And that starts now. I placed a folder on the table and slid it forward. This vineyard has been coasting for years. My father ran it the same way his father did, and for a long time that worked, but the market has changed, the industry has changed, and if we don't evolve, we'll fall behind. I gestured toward the folder. That's our new plan. We're modernizing production, investing in sustainable farming practices, expanding distribution. We're not just going to compete, we're going to dominate. Silence filled the room. Then one of the senior winemakers, an older man named Richard, who had been with the vineyard longer than I had been alive, leaned forward. And if we don't agree? I met his gaze without hesitation. Then you're free to leave. Another long pause. Then slowly he nodded. All right, he said. Let's see what you've got. That was all I needed. Over the next few months, the vineyard transformed. We streamlined production, cut unnecessary costs, secured deals with larger distributors, and rebranded with a fresh, modern approach. The vineyard was no longer just surviving. And then one evening, months after it all started, I received a message from my father. It was short. You won. Hope you're happy. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing my response. I didn't win, Dad. I just stopped losing. I hit send, then turned off my phone. The past was behind me, the future was mine to build, and this time, I was doing it on my terms.